My initial draft of this sermon went into the origins of the debate between whether we are saved by faith or by works, why Martin Luther did not want to include the book of James in his German translation of the Bible and blocked the book from being taught in the university in Heidelberg and said, "Someday I will use James to fire my stove." But by the time I had finished all of that, there was no more time left in the sermon for my main point. So I tossed that on Friday morning and started over. I will simply sum up all of that by saying that if you have ever advocated for today's Christians to practice the things Jesus actually taught his followers to do, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, welcoming the stranger, loving your neighbor, etc., and have had someone shout in your face, "That's works righteousness," that is Luther's fault. The book of James has been set against Paul's words in Romans 3 about being saved by faith ever since. And how otherwise brilliant theologians could not see that such a division was not ever necessary is only comprehensible to me if they found that position to be politically or personally expedient in whatever century they found themselves. It took the Lutherans themselves until 2013 to resolve that issue amongst themselves when they wisely pointed out the obvious. And Paul were addressing two different mistakes in two groups of people. Paul was stressing faith to those who thought what people believed was unimportant. And James was dealing with the opposite mistake of thinking that God's just cool with any kind of behavior as long as we profess the right beliefs. They and others could have gotten there over a millennium earlier had they just, read the book of James. For that matter, Romans is as much a defender of the works of the law as James is of faith, if you bother to read past chapter 3 of the book of Romans. But James is very much easier to read than Paul is. In the Bible itself, one of the letters from Peter complains about how obtuse it is to try to read Paul. It's academic language, you have to parse it carefully and all of that. James is much more straightforward. So when James says in chapter 2, verse 18, "But someone will say, 'You have faith, I have works.' Well, show me your faith without works, and I by my works will show you my faith." That is the ball game. And then in the verses after what Kathy read this morning, James further connects the dots with some examples from the Old Testament, which was the only Bible that they had at the time. And he uses Abraham, and a line that sort of knocked me over a couple decades ago as he's talking about the righteousness of Abraham, when James says that Abraham's faith was made complete by what he did. The following through, there was a spectrum. He had faith, but that faith wasn't complete until it was evidenced in Abraham's actions. And I have long thought that, at least in English translations, the point could be more easily made if we replaced the word faith with faithfulness. The latter has behavior baked into its meaning. We can't talk about faithfulness without imagining doing something in response to what we believe. And separating by saying just faith, it puts that into an intellectual category that makes, I think, a false distinction between what we believe and what we do. Because the simple psychology is that unless we are restrained physically, legally, or morally, what we believe will at some point turn into action. That's woven into the Sermon on the Mount and other teachings of Jesus in many places, but it's not anything unique to his teaching or the teaching of any religion. It's just a human thing that our actions spring from what we have come to believe about the world around us. I believe that our climate is changing, and I have acted on that every time I have bought a home. I want to know the level above sea level. When I was buying a house on the Cape, I want to know what the climate risks are going forward in an area where I'm considering property. Because I believe that, because I take that very seriously, that is factored into everything that I do. And you do the same, maybe not with that belief, but with others. Especially when you believe there's a threat of some kind. If you believe there's a high threat of burglary in your area, you're likely to go out and get an alarm system. When you're suddenly afraid of the threat of hell, you sit up and pay attention, and the church says you got to do this or you're going to hell, and you do that with women wearing a hat in church. Whatever. That's human nature. It's how we behave. You want to know what you believe? Look at what you do. Absent interference or restraint, belief leads to action, and action showcases what we truly believe. When those two things are in sync, we're living lives that are true to ourselves and true to our values. Now, that said, while it's good to have those things in sync, there are beliefs and values that stand in stark opposition to each other and result in vastly different actions and ways of living in the world. One of the core purposes of both religion and politics is to evaluate the beliefs associated with a candidate for office, with a civic organization, or a religious group, and to do our best in thinking about where those beliefs might lead, should there suddenly be no restraint, and whether we would be comfortable in participating in that outcome, whatever it is. In the weeks after 9/11, we began to find out more about the terrorists who flew the suicide missions that destroyed the World Trade Center, hit the Pentagon, and were thwarted from hitting either the Capitol or the White House, wherever they were headed, by the brave passengers on Flight 93, who learned what was happening elsewhere, stormed the cockpit, and brought the whole plane crashing down in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. They chose to end their lives to save others instead of allowing themselves to be turned into a weapon that was headed to kill as many others as possible. One of the things that came out in those first few weeks afterwards were pamphlets that they had found that were basically devotionals for the hijackers, reminding them why they were doing what they were doing to help them keep up their resolve and their courage. They were statements of belief to justify their actions. I was chilled to the bone as I read them, not because they were horrible, but because they were all things that I had either heard or said myself in Christian contexts. They were words about obedience to God's command and promises to God's faithful. There were promises of eternal life, rewards for faithfulness, even and especially if you gave up your life for it. I could have read those pamphlets from the pulpit without saying where they came from, and people would have applauded my sermon going out the door. Had the heroes who stormed the cockpit and took down Flight 93 had those pamphlets, They might well have been as strengthened in their resolve to save others as the hijackers were strengthened in their resolve to kill. As I was sort of hit in the face by that, the thought that something I might say from the pulpit, or even privately for that matter, that could be used to justify mass slaughter, kept me burning the midnight oil for many weeks to try to figure out what nuance could be included in my words to prevent them from being twisted to harm instead of being used for good. And I'm not sure I have totally resolved that. But I think at least a good chunk of the answer is first the basic recognition that faith and action are linked. Just ignoring beliefs because we consider them fringe or extreme or not connected with my side, and we say, well, who could believe that? It's not worth taking that seriously. That has given us Christian nationalists and white supremacists in positions of unchecked power where they're starting wars, holding the nuclear codes, and illegally snatching people off the streets and putting them in inhumane detention camps with no one willing or able to restrain them. Understand that those outcomes are directed by people whose beliefs about God and the world are in sync with those actions. While we need more nuance on the faith side of the equation, we have to be clearer about the risks on the works side and the direct connection between those two. The faith works continuum, for me, is that I believe Jesus speaks with God's voice and acts according to the fruit of righteousness in the heart of God. So what Jesus says and does are my model and guide. When I say I am a Christian, I take the name of Christ, and Christ's words are paramount for me. Now, I don't always live up to that, but that's my goal. And Jesus' focus, from his first teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, in the Beatitudes, where he calls out blessings on the poor and the hungry, to his last night on earth when he washes the feet of his disciples, including Judas, is on how to treat people in the here and now, in the flesh, on this earth, incarnation. The biblical visions of a world of joy and peace for all people and the banquet where all are welcome are not just a promise for the life after this one. They are the ideal world that God expects us to work for with the one precious earthly life that we have been given. Later in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaches that we can tell false prophets from true prophets by their fruit, that is, by their works. True and false prophets may all sound the same when you listen to them, but it's the actions that will tell you what someone truly believes. Jesus gives us one and only one description of the final judgment of humanity, which helpfully includes all the criteria that God's going to look for those who are ushered into God's kingdom and those who will be cast into a lake of fire reserved for the devil and his angels. You will find it in Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 46. And the criteria are all actions. The righteous are those who feed the hungry, give a drink to the thirsty, welcome the stranger, give clothing to the naked, take care of the sick, and visit those in prison. That is the exact and complete list. And the list of things that gets you a trip to the flames is not some different list of sins or people who believe this or not that. It's simply the people who don't do the list of things that was just given to the righteous. If you want the more succinct version, when Jesus is asked in Luke 10, verse 25, what a person needs to do to inherit eternal life, the answer is to love God and your neighbor as yourself. Period. End of story. What we believe is critically important, and that does need some nuance. If we say we believe in God, for example, we need to be more specific about the nature of that God. Because as James reminds us in chapter 2, verse 19, you believe that God is one. You do well. Even the demons believe that and shudder. If you say, I believe in justice, that's a start, but so does ICE. Define your terms. But we would also be well advised to balance our verbal witness by the words of St. Francis, who said, preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. We are far too late in recognizing that beliefs will become actions and bad theology will become bad policy, and the ideas we ignore because they sound too crazy to us are just one viral video away from public office. Belief and action, faith and works are inseparable and will in time affect us all. But also, while the consequences of our inattention are going to last for generations, and the ship called normal has sailed, we can still, within our own communities and spheres of influence, create what Margaret Wheatley describes as sanity. How do we do that? Here's an example from an event last month on a 30-degree day in Chicago. There was a young man, Leo Cundiff, who was sitting on a bench and talking on the phone by the harbor when he heard a woman scream. He looked up and saw her chasing a stroller, her baby girl strapped inside, as it got caught up in a 50-mile-per-hour wind gust. She couldn't reach the stroller in time, and both stroller and baby flew into the frigid waters of Lake Michigan. Leo, who does not swim, jumped into the freezing waters himself to save her. He got to the baby and tried to keep the stroller floating upright, treading water, as he began to realize that he had no way to get either of them out. After about 4 minutes, a second man came on the scene and threw his jacket down for Leo to grab, and between that man and the girl's mother, they pulled Leo, the baby, and the stroller out. Both Leo and the baby were taken to different hospitals and treated. They are both now fine. As Leo was interviewed afterwards and described what went through his mind throughout that ordeal, his words, I think, illustrate the point. After noting that the mother was, quote, too panicked to do anything, her belief that she couldn't do anything just froze her, Leo thought, I guess I'm jumping in. I wasn't going to let that baby die. That's crazy. Right there is a belief that is core to who Leo is. It's crazy to let a baby die when you have the ability to do something about it. Or maybe even if you don't, because Leo couldn't swim. Leo is a trans man, targeted by hate in every way imaginable from all sides. But he didn't let the hate of others corrupt his own soul. He could not return hate for hate and say, well, whatever happens, happens. I got my own worries. He couldn't wall himself off from the suffering of others. Now imagine a world where every person, even if they just held one belief, if it was Leo's core belief that it's crazy to watch a child of any nation, of any color or class, die, when you can do something to prevent it, even if you might die trying. When Leo was in the water with the baby and realized he didn't know how long he could keep either of them afloat, he said, I just kind of grabbed her hand and just rubbed her hand a little. That too is an action that sprang from a belief that even in what might be your final actions on earth, let no one die alone or without compassion. Something that's core to hospice, for example. Leo also noted that he didn't really realize his own beliefs until they moved him to act. He said, turns out, if I have to choose fight or flight, I guess I'm a fighter. I always thought I was a runner, but I guess not today. What we believe about ourselves isn't always accurate. It's our actions that prove our values and what we really believe, sometimes surprising even ourselves. His response to all the attention was to say, all I did was a human act. I'm just a human who did the most human thing you could do, which is to save someone who can't save themselves. Who we believe we are as human beings, all of us together and each of us individually, may lie buried deep within us. If somebody said, what do you believe about human beings? You might not be able to actually articulate that. But when the moment to act comes, when we are the only person with the power to do something, when we see a crisis unfold, what we believe about the role of human beings in the world, who we are willing to label as human, what we believe about relationships and responsibilities to those we have never met, what we believe about who it would be crazy to let die or who might be expendable, those beliefs show up in that moment, and sometimes in very public ways. The second chapter of James could easily be mistaken for an op-ed from this week. If someone tries to suck you into a works righteousness versus faith alone debate, just bookmark James 2 on your phone and read it to them. And if they say in response that you're obviously going to hell, pull it up again and read again verses 12 through 13. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment will be without mercy to anyone who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Then call it a day. Amen.